Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator, and I'm here to conquer your lands and convert you to Catholicism. No, actually I'm not. I'm just wearing a kind of a not very good quality Conquistador style Morion helmet. Maybe I'll talk about this in a future video, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm actually here to talk about something quite specific relating to a video that my mate Raffaello, Metatron channel, the Metatron, he has spread his wings and he has talked about that topic which lots of people have talked about, which I'm not really going to talk about, and that is Black Achilles. Okay, so the BBC series featuring the Siege of Troy, and they've cast certain pivotal roles to black actors. I'm not going to talk about that, other than to say that Raffaello picks up on a point at the end of his video talking about Achilles' helmet. Now, Achilles has been played by various actors over the last however many decades that movie history has been taking place, but most famously probably Brad Pitt as well was the other one. And Raf made a curious statement at the end of his video about this particular rendition of Achilles' character having the wrong helmet. And I thought, is that right? Because I grew up in London. I don't live in London anymore. But one of the great things about London is it isn't ancient Greece, but it has the British Museum, and it also has the Museum of London and the Wallace Collection and the Tower. You should come to London, and I'll be expecting my commission from the London Tourist Board. But the main point is that the British Museum has a whole bunch of ancient Greek helmets in it. Now, the first thing we have to say is that, of course, the helmet that Achilles would have worn in the time of the Siege of Troy, if that actually happened. I think most people accept that it's based roughly on some type of historical event. But the type of helmet that he would have worn wouldn't have looked like the classical kind of Greek helmets that we recognise from Greek vases and Greek art from the sort of 6th, 7th century BC, because it was set earlier. Okay, so as I understand it, the first stories talking about Troy were written down in about the 7th century BC. Correct me if I'm slightly wrong, but I think that's more or less right. But probably, or are supposed to relate to events which happened a lot earlier. And certainly the assumption is that there's an oral tradition of telling these stories, which does go back earlier. So the stories are definitely earlier. And if they're based on any real events, they are earlier. But for obvious reasons, because we expect ancient Greeks to look a certain way, like they do on the vases and all of that kind of stuff, people who've created the Siege of Troy story on the silver screen, for example in the movie Troy, which I have to say I actually quite like. Lots of people pan it, but there are lots of things about it I like. Quite like the fighting in it as well, actually. Maybe not the battles, and Lindy Beige has done some good coverage of those. But anyway, understandably, they do go to the classical, famous era, Corinthian-style helmets and such like, to represent these characters, and I understand that. So, coming back to the original point, is Raffaello correct that that this particular rendition of Achilles, his helmet, is completely wrong? He mentions that it's too open. Well, fundamentally, I'd say no. I'm sorry, Raf, I think you're wrong. Okay, and there's one reason for that, because the helmet that we see on this particular Achilles actually looks quite like a bunch of bronze helmets which survive, and I recognised, as soon as I saw it, I recognised it, or vaguely recognised the general shape of it, from helmets I'd seen in the British Museum growing up when I was at university and such like. And it's based on, or very clearly based on, a type of helmet known as the Illyrian type. Now, the Illyrian type of helmet, ironically, is not really from Illyria. It's a Greek type of helmet that was used all over the area of Greek influence, but a particularly large number of them have been found in Illyria, which is why it has commonly become known as the Illyrian type helmet. And this particular version of Achilles is wearing a helmet that in outline, maybe not in exact detail, but in outline, is essentially an Illyrian helmet, and there's nothing wrong with it. Yes, we do commonly think of the stylized Corinthian helmet with these beautiful eye and holes and slots. And remember also that that helmet is so fundamentally beautiful to us that it's incredibly strong image, and I'm sure this was one of the reasons why it was so popular. It's such a strong iconic image that it was copied later in the medieval period with the barbuta, as it's sometimes known, a type of sallet which has a type of face opening which at the beginning of the Renaissance was harking back to these ancient Greek heroes. And you have to remember, in the medieval period, they had access to these, to the vases and the art showing ancient Greeks. And so they knew what those helmets looked like. They read the stories of Troy. The stories of Troy had been translated continuously from antiquity through the Roman period, through the so-called Dark Ages in places like the Byzantium, and in fact Western Europe as well, by monks. Translated into Latin and into later ecclesiastical Latin, and the medieval people knew these stories, and many of the manuscripts we actually use as examples showing medieval armour, okay, from manuscripts, are actually showing stories from the ancient world. They're not showing medieval stories, they're showing ancient stories, sometimes biblical, but very often historical events from Greece and Rome and elsewhere. So the fact is that this type of helmet, this Corinthian helmet, is very iconic. But what you shouldn't think is that just because this iconic Corinthian style helmet that we're so familiar with, and even medieval people were so familiar with and associated with the ancient Greek world, this wasn't the only type of Greek helmet. There were many types of Greek helmet. In fact, maybe I'll do a video purely on that subject, and this is, I suppose, an introduction to that topic. By all means, go away, Google it, Google ancient Greek helmets, and you will see that there are many types of helmets. Many of them are quite open-faced, some of them are quite broad-brimmed, and in fact this Illyrian helmet looks very like the helmet shown in the recent BBC version of the story of Troy, showing Achilles. One minor detail, the reinforcement plate that they've attached to the front of it is probably not really correct, and I suspect is harking back to the helmets which are featured in the 300, where they were stylistically not very historical. And they made a design choice to have these kind of separate plates on the front, and maybe that harks back to that. It's also really important to point out that you can't really say that because the conventional Corinthian helmets that we're familiar with have good face protection, that a helmet which has less than that doesn't have enough face protection. I think that's an unfair statement, because of course in the ancient Greek world there were many types of helmet which didn't have as much facial protection as this particular famous type of Corinthian helmet. And moreover, of course, we can draw other parallels from history. I'm holding one, a morion. It has no face protection at all, other than the fact that it has a brim. And remember that brims are a form of face protection. People tend to look at the face and go, oh, the face is completely uncovered. Well, while the face may be completely uncovered, if you're fighting with a shield and a side sword, as I might be with a morion, or shield and a partisan, or this type of thing, then yes, indeed, things will be coming straight at my face. But the advantage of having an open face is I've now got great peripheral vision. I've got quite good hearing actually in this helmet, and breathing. Okay, so breathing, vision, hearing, super important things. As soon as you start to enclose the face, you lose hearing, you lose peripheral vision initially, and then even forward vision in the most extreme cases of some medieval helmets. And to some extent it restricts breathing if it comes anywhere in front of your mouth as well. Can in fact impede speaking. And remember that if you're any kind of officer, or even just one of the rank and file, speaking and giving, relaying commands or giving information to your comrades either side of you might be important. So to say that open face helmets are somehow less than face covered helmets is a nonsense actually historically. Think of modern helmets, okay? We simply, for the most part, most modern infantry soldiers could not wear helmets which had a lot of face covering because it would impede their abilities to bring a rifle up to the cheek. Same thing for longbowmen, crossbowmen, or indeed their ability to hear and talk and breathe and see. And sight, super important. As soon as you've got anybody with missile weapons who needs to be able to look around, you need really, really good visibility. So it's always a trade-off. So, you know, the Roman Legionaries helmet is a perfect example of that. Yes, it has cheek pieces, but remember it has openings for the ears and actually it doesn't have any nasal. Except for the very late ones, it doesn't have any nasal, and essentially has an open face. So yes, it's open to the front, but think about what is gained from that. Okay, so don't always think about helmets about what they cover. Oh, and I mentioned the brim. What I meant to say was, you're thinking about frontally, the brim doesn't offer any protection, but things coming downwards, okay? So I've got my sword and shield and I'm fighting. Things coming straight at me are defended and deflected by my sword and shield. Things coming downwards are now going to hit this brim, and anything that comes down here, I've got a huge amount of protection there. Anything that comes down here is going to catch on that brim, much like what I said about the rear of the Roman helmet. So when you look at specific designs of helmets, context, okay? Don't only think about the helmet in isolation. Think about what else is the person wearing with that helmet. We look at the salle behind me there. You think, well, it's got no protection for the lower face. That's because they're worn with a bever, usually. They're intended to be anyway. So you've got to take the helmet within its full context. Is it used with shields? Is it used with polearms? Is it for missile troops? What kind of weapons are things being thrown at me, usually, or shot at me? Or are things going to be crashing down on my head? Or, you know, you've got to look at it holistically. You've got to look at the entire picture before you can really judge, is a helmet good or bad? And you know what? The general assumption should always be that if a helmet was popular in history, it's probably good for its intended purpose. Otherwise, it wouldn't have existed in history and been used for very long. So absolutely, open face isn't always bad, not at all, okay? And we know that in the ancient Greek world, they had many types of helmet which did have open faces. They weren't all like Corinthian helmets. Anyway, just to finish up there, I hope this has been somewhat interesting. Ancient Greek helmets and ancient world helmets in general. I know I talked about Roman helmets recently. Have a look under my recent videos if you haven't seen that one yet. A very, very interesting topic. And also just to mention on Roman helmets, yes, in fact, Roman helmets drew influence from Greek helmets very clearly. And some people said, oh, it's just a copy of the Gallic helmet, the helmet from Gaul, what's now mostly France. And in a way, that's correct. It is correct. It's known as the Gallic helmet of the Roman legionary. But what I would say is the Gallic helmet was influenced by the earlier Greek helmets as well. So they're all interrelated. You can't always say with helmets that they come from a specific place, because often there's many different influences, complex influences. The Italian medieval barbuta is a great example of that. It's an Italian medieval helmet, but it very clearly has ancient Greek influence. Right, so I'm going to wrap it up there, but there we go. So Achilles' helmet is not totally inaccurate. It's not 100% accurate, but it's not totally inaccurate, and it's modelled on the Illyrian helmet from the ancient Greek world. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.